Alright guys, welcome back into Contemporary Issue Wednesday. Today we're going to take the template of realism and liberalism that I described last week and apply it to a practical real-world example, the Syrian Civil War, so let's get into it. Alright guys, so last week I described liberalism and realism. Briefly put, realism is the viewpoint that states are just out to maximize their own power. They're just self-interested. All they're doing is trying to expand their material capabilities and their security interests in the international realm, and they're not really bothered about what the political systems of other states are. They're really about just promoting their own interests. Liberals, on the other hand, believe that states can transcend this fundamental power struggle and get into areas of more international cooperation. They can pursue peace, and they can even start to become so interdependent that values like human rights and democracy can actually be exported around the world. Now, what we're going to do today is take these two templates and focus on a real-world issue, the Syrian Civil War, and specifically what we're going to do is we're going to pretend like we are the United States of America, and what we're going to do is we're going to take the template of liberalism and realism and say, how would a liberalist United States react to the Syrian Civil War, and how would a realist United States react to the Civil War? And what I'm going to do is basically say, I'm the United States, I'm a liberalist, here's how I'd react, and then I will give the realist response to each of these reasons. Now, simply put, I think liberals would probably be more apt to intervene in the Syrian Civil War militarily, whereas I believe realists would be very, very reticent, very hesitant to intervene militarily. One more caveat before we get going. I'm not saying all liberals would believe in intervention, and I'm not saying all realists wouldn't believe in intervention. I'm just giving you guys a broad overview, and that's my disclaimer. So if we were liberals and we were looking at Syria, we would say a number of things would precipitate the United States intervening in the Syrian Civil War. The first of which would be international norms have been breached. What do I mean by international norms? Well, norms are basically standards or laws even that most international states believe to be very important, very vital to the international system. And these norms in Syria would include things like, the protection of non-combatants, the protection of human rights, not using chemical weapons in warfare. All of these things are sort of norms that the international community agrees that should not be broken. Liberals would argue that the Assad regime has verifiably broken all of these norms, and I don't think realists could really argue with that. Assad definitely has done that. He's used chemical weapons, he's slaughtered thousands of civilians, he's used barrel bombing techniques to indiscriminately bomb highly populated civilian areas because he knows that it's a very, very potent weapon. All of these things are norms that Assad has broken. Realists would respond by saying, yep, Assad has violated international norms, but sadly, the fact that Assad bombs his own citizens has literally no effect on the United States of America. He's not bombing us. He's not trying to invade us. Why should we get involved there? And if you're talking about international norms being broken, well, then you could apply that to many other countries around the world who are stifling human rights, who are using torture, who are using detentions, illegal detentions. All these types of things are going on all around the world. Why is Syria specifically important? Yes, there's more death, but why should we invade there and not other places that are using or that are breaking international norms? We can't do all of these, and we can't do it in Syria. It's not to the United States' strategic advantage. We don't really gain anything from going into Syria except engaging in warfare that cost a lot of money, that cost a lot of lives. The second thing liberals might say is that the whole Assad regime is just evil. They're violating human rights, they're violating human dignity, and as Americans, as a moral authority in the world, we should assert the moral authority and say, hey, this type of behavior is not going to happen on our watch. Now, realists would respond to this and say, there's nowhere is it written in the world that the United States has to be the moral authority, A. B, in the Constitution of the United States, it says nothing about the United States being the moral authority. C, who cares about being the moral authority? D, we've already lost our right to being the moral authority when we invaded Iraq on very questionable grounds and we unleashed sectarian tensions there when we ourselves engaged in torture in Abu Ghraib and different places like that. So being the moral authority isn't necessarily a rank that the United States can grasp to now. And finally, is this even a moral thing to do? Is it moral to send, the United States soldiers in to die for a country that's not theirs, for people's freedom that's not theirs, for people's security that's not theirs? Wouldn't it be more rational to make Syrians have to hash it out themselves and figure out what kind of system they want than having, American lives lives be put at risk for something that's not even theirs? Is that a moral thing to ask our young men and women to have to go into harm's way? Maybe it isn't actually a very moral thing to do. Liberalists might then say, well, we should use international institutions, right? International institutions are in place to avert such tragedies as this. And realists would retort and say, hey, look, the UN has been woefully inadequate at solving these problems. In fact, the UN is part and parcel to the reason why Syria isn't getting saved. The biggest reason why the UN isn't helpful is because the Security Council, the UN Security Council, which is by far the most important body of the UN when deciding about military intervention, has Russia on its Security Council, and Russia can veto any military option that the UN Security Council puts on the table. And this just points to the ineffectiveness of international institutions in actually preventing warfare. That's what realists would say. Now, if liberalists want to contort and say, hey, why don't we just develop another institution, or why don't we just excommunicate Russia from the UN Security Council and then go in? Well, you can do that, but you're also going to have to face Russia on the ground, and your whole theory about international institutions creating cooperation amongst states is kind of debunked, because you're having to excommunicate different states in order to pursue peace, but that doesn't really mean you're including all of the states in the picture. So the UN has almost proven the realist point that international institutions don't really promote or provide peace. And actually, in this instance, what they're doing is they're providing an arena for individual states like Russia and the US and Iran and Syria to actually engage in power politics, but just in an institutional basis. Finally, liberals would say it's just the right thing to do. I mean, anyone who can just look at this on a common sense scenario is we as an international community, we as the United States, we can't countenance the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of people, the over $200 billion of damage to infrastructure in the economy that the civil war is wreaking on Syria. And the United States would say, maybe, maybe not, but it's not in our strategic interest. If we invade Syria, if we don't invade Syria, we don't really gain much. I mean, before the Syrian Civil War, how much did the United States trade with Syria? How many bases did we have with Syria? And so again, the realist is sitting back saying, look, I understand that this situation is terrible, that it's horrific, that hundreds of thousands of people are dying. But realists would respond to this and say, does intervention actually even work? I mean, we tried doing something. We tried intervening and toppling a bad regime in Saddam Hussein, and what happened was worse. We unleashed even more sectarian tension in the region. We unleashed civil war. There wasn't a clear leadership, unifying leadership in Iraq that rose up out of the ashes. Syria is much worse than even Iraq ever was, and if we toppled Assad, what would take its place? You might think Assad's bad, but what comes after Assad might be much, much worse. So the realist would say it's not even clear that if we intervened, we'd get a better outcome. In fact, we might unleash more instability. We might unleash even more violence in the region. So the moral high ground is actually the realist high ground, is to say we're going to back up and we're going to let this situation just handle itself. Because again, we don't have a lot of strategic interest in the region, and we can't ask our own people to go in and die for a cause that's not even about directly related to themselves. So that's what the realist would say, and the liberal would say, you're just wrong. This is wrong. What's happening in Syria is wrong, and we are standing by, and we are a party to it because we're doing nothing. All right, guys, what do you think of the situation? In my eyes, it looks like the liberals might have the edge on the moral argument, because in doing nothing, the United States and the international community does look like they're aiding and abetting the Assad regime and their genocidal massacre of the Syrian population. However, I think the realists have the strategic advantage here, because, it's really difficult to say what the strategic advantages the United States and the West gets in toppling the Assad regime, A. B. Maybe even morally speaking, what do you get when you topple the Assad regime? How long is it going to take? How long is the effort going to take to rebuild Syria? And will you even get a unified political leadership outside of Syria, outside of the Assad regime after you topple him? What comes next? Maybe it's even worse than the Assad regime. Maybe what happens in Syria becomes a breeding ground of even more jihadists like the Islamic State, Jabhat al-Nusra. Who knows, guys? I leave it over to you. What do you think? Do you come out on the liberal side of the interventionist opinion, or do you come out on the realist side of strategic restraint? Let me know. Comment below. Like the videos, guys. Share the videos and subscribe to this channel for all your realist needs. But until then, until I see you next time, reality always trumps ideology.